Building codes and life safety codes cover basic minimum requirements to protect the health, safety, and welfare of a building's users and neighbors. Codes deal with a number of issues, including a building's minimum structural requirements, a need for fresh air, and a system to get people out in case of an emergency. The basic concepts behind emergency egress will be the focus of this video. We will cover standards established by the International Code Council and the National Fire Protection Association, found in the International Building Code and in NFPA 101, the Life Safety Code. Building codes are a result of an ongoing cycle of adjustments based on consensus standards. In fact, the history of codes dates back to 1750 BC in Mesopotamia with the Code of Hammurabi. In it were harsh penalties laid out for faulty construction that harmed people or property. Modern codes are consensus standards developed by experts from all stakeholder groups. Examples include researchers, manufacturers, owners, users, and public officials. During the code development process, anyone can recommend a change to the committee. The committee then reaches a consensus about whether the change should be adopted or not. Codes are adopted in the United States, so each city may not always be using the most current version. A new version of the codes are typically developed on 3-year cycles, and each state, county, and city can create its own code or adjust it with local amendments. While the requirements are very similar, this typically results in each jurisdiction having its own set of rules. It is important to check which code version is used and what local amendments apply at the very beginning of the design process. The International Code Council represents the 1994 merging of codes from different regions in the US. The National Fire Protection Association is independent of the ICC, but it deals with many of the same issues, covering a wide variety of fire protection system topics. In this video, we will review the basics of egress design, including travel path safety, door swings, locked doors, length of travel paths, and dead-end corridors. We will cover adequate width calculations based on occupancy, changes in width, and merging flow. And finally, options and travel path disruption, common path of travel, remoteness of exits, and exit discharge. At the end of the film, you should be able to calculate occupancy loads, determine sizes and lengths of egress elements, identify dead-end corridors, and understand how previous fire tragedies and human behavior have affected egress safety. Incidentally, good egress, or exiting design, is typically good circulation design for everyday use that is clear and intuitive for users. Complicated and confusing circulation design can cause problems both in an emergency and in everyday use. Circulation is a system that includes stairwells, corridors, lobbies, and doors, and is integrated with all building systems. If it is well designed from the beginning, people will enjoy the building, and expensive adjustments are avoided. Consideration must be given to users both familiar with the building and those new to the building. The first step in designing egress elements according to code and assessing code compliance is understanding occupancy, or the intended use of a building. A building can have more than one occupancy. In this building, we have retail with a restaurant on the first 2 floors and offices above those. This is known as mixed use. Factors that affect occupancy classification might include the number of people that would be present in the building at any time, the density of the number of people, what they are doing, how well they are able to react to an emergency, and how hazardous the building may be. For example, egress requirements for a nightclub that serves liquor and may host a concert with pyrotechnic displays are more stringent than those for a storage facility. The different occupancies or intended uses of buildings and rooms can be categorized. In assembly buildings, there can be large crowds of people who may be unfamiliar with the building. Assembly is subdivided based on the density of the group of people and whether the seating is fixed or not. Assembly Group A1 usually has fixed seating. Assembly A2 includes uses intended for food and drink consumption. Assembly A3 includes a variety of uses intended for worship, recreation, or amusement. Assembly A4 is for indoor sporting events, and A5 is for viewing outdoor activities. When gathering many people in one assembly space, it is important to accommodate emergency and everyday high-volume exiting in a short time, so the code is more restrictive in assembly uses. Business use can include offices, places where professional services are offered, or educational buildings for those above the 12th grade. The people in business occupancies tend to be alert adults familiar with the building, but there are still hundreds of fire and emergency-related injuries and deaths at the workplace each year. Educational occupancy is for buildings for children up to the 12th grade. There are more stringent egress requirements for these buildings because of the number of children that are present. Factory or industrial occupancy deals with buildings used for manufacturing or processing. In these occupancies, there are relatively few people, and they are all likely familiar with the building. There are high-hazard buildings which store hazardous materials or house activities that involve the use of hazardous materials. These occupancies have more restrictive egress requirements because of the threat posed to the occupants in the event of a fire. Institutional occupancies are those in which people have special restrictions on them that might affect their ability to exit in an emergency. This includes hospitals, prisons, or boarding care facilities. Mercantile occupancies involve the sale of goods and some storage. These occupancies have a greater risk to people from fire due to the merchandise that is present, and there are usually people there that are not familiar with the building. Residential occupancies are subdivided according to type of housing, single family or multifamily, the occupant's familiarity with the surroundings, and the ability to exit in an emergency. Residential occupancy also includes hotels, dormitories, and apartments. People living in an apartment building may be familiar with their egress options, while hotel visitors have just arrived. All of these, though, will involve people who might be sleeping when an emergency occurs. Storage involves occupancies that store non-hazardous materials. Similar to industrial occupancies, few people are present, and they are typically familiar with the building. Utility and miscellaneous occupancies are usually accessory buildings that are occupied only for a short time. Be sure to refer to the code for all possible occupancy classifications, as occupancy impacts many aspects of emergency egress. Before we go further, let's cover a few definitions. First, exit access is the portion of an egress system that leads from an occupied area to an exit. This can include corridors, open stairs, or an aisle within an assembly occupancy. Next, we have exits. An exit is the portion of an egress system between exit access and exit discharge. It can be an exit door, an exit stairwell or ramp, or an exit passageway. The exit will be enclosed by fire-rated walls. The codes assume that once a person enters the exit, they are safe from the effects of a fire. This safety will only occur if all of the required passive and active fire protection systems are installed in accordance with relevant codes. Then we have exit discharge. It is the portion of the egress system between the termination of an exit and a public way. A public way is a street, alley, or open area of land of public use that is clear so that people can move away from the building to safety. Enclosed alleys do not typically serve as a public way. Returning to our mixed-use example, we know it is over 75 feet above fire department vehicle access, which qualifies it as a high-rise. Once we determine its intended uses or occupancy classifications, we can calculate the occupancy load or potential number of people occupying a building at any given time. Note that in this building, the users are assumed to be adults who are awake and familiar with the building, able to leave quickly without grabbing too many personal belongings. The IBC and NFPA 101 tell us the maximum floor area allowances per occupant for specific uses, which are even a bit more detailed than the overall occupancy classification. We find the occupant load factor for each space in the building and determine the designed area in square feet. Notice that some load factors are listed as net and some are gross. The gross floor area is the square footage within the inside perimeter of the exterior walls of the building, minus vent shafts and courts. Include the area for corridors, stairwells, closets, the thickness of interior walls, columns, or other features like a covered ground floor. Net floor area is the actual occupied area not including unoccupied accessory areas such as corridors, stairwells, toilet rooms, mechanical rooms, and closets. It is assumed in net occupancies that the interior walls will not be reconfigured over time. In our example, our office space floors are B, or business occupancy. Looking at the IBC, we see that the occupant load factor is 100 gross square feet per occupant. So, one takes the gross floor area and divides it by the load factor to get the number of occupants. So we have 12,650 square feet divided by 100 square feet per occupant, which equals 127 occupants. We round all decimal numbers up. This would be the same process for all of the upper office levels. On the lower floors, we have a restaurant and retail stores. Retail is M, or mercantile use. There is an occupant load factor of 60 gross square feet per occupant. So 11,050 square feet divided by 60 square feet per occupant equals 185 occupants for that level. In the retail, we also have mezzanines. We use the same load factor of 60 gross square feet per occupant for the mezzanine level spaces. So 6,875 square feet divided by 60 square feet per occupant equals 115 occupants for that level. For the restaurant, under assembly without fixed seats, unconcentrated with tables and chairs, there is an occupant load factor of 15 net square feet. So 7,855 square feet divided by 15 square feet per occupant equals 524 occupants. Add all of these to get the total occupant load of 1,713 occupants. The occupant load is a factor that tells us how many exits the spaces and floors should have. According to code, for many occupancies with less than 50 occupants, only one exit is needed. If specifying only one exit, it is important to check for the presence of a sprinkler system and what the common path of egress travel distance is, which we will cover in a few moments. In many occupancies, for 50 to 500 occupants, 2 exits are needed. For 501 to 1,000 occupants, 3 are needed. 4 exits are needed for over 1,000 occupants. For some high-rise buildings, an additional stair may also be required. At the ground floor, we have 709 occupants, so we need 3 exits. We have more than that here, but we also need to check that each area and space within the building have the adequate number of exits. For example, looking at the conference space, it is assembly unconcentrated, so its load factor is 15 net. Dividing the area by 15, we see that there are 53.3 occupants, rounded to 54. Since this is greater than 50, 2 exits are needed out of the room. So, once the number of occupants and number of exits are determined for each space, travel path safety must be considered. An important rule in the code is that the doors used for egress should always swing in the direction of travel if the occupant load is greater than 50, or it is a high hazard occupancy. Egress doors should never be blocked or locked, although that is too frequently done. In the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911 in Manhattan, owners locked doors to the exit stairwells to prevent unscheduled breaks and stealing. There were further issues with doors swinging inward and inadequate fire escapes. 146 workers died, many of them from jumping to escape the fire. Although that happened long ago, this event led to important code changes and resulted in the formation of what is now the NFPA 101. Tragically, this problem still exists. In 1991 in Hamlet, North Carolina, at the Imperial Food Processing Plant, dozens of workers again were killed due to locked doors. And as recently as 2012 in Karachi, Pakistan, hundreds of workers were killed due to locked exit doors in the garment factory. Over and over we learned that egress doors should swing in the direction people are moving, and they should be unobstructed. Doors to rooms like offices or others with small occupancies, on the other hand, could swing into the room to avoid disrupting the egress flow of others. When a door swings in the direction of travel, when fully opened, it must not reduce the required width of a corridor or stair landing by more than 7 inches. In occupancies requiring 2 exits, the door in any position may not reduce the egress width by half. We also need to be sure any person does not need to travel too far before reaching a protected area. We therefore measure the length of exit access travel distance, which is the distance from the most remote portion of the room or floor to the next level of protection, either to an enclosed stairway or outside. Although it is not specified in the code how the measurement is done, we might consider the location of furniture when measuring travel distance. It is most conservative to measure at right angles. Studies show that adults walking by themselves can be expected to move at approximately 1.2 meters, or just under 4 feet per second. However, speeds can be much slower if the density of people increases or when people are on stairs. For occupancies A and M, the maximum travel distance is 200 feet for non-sprinklered buildings, 250 for sprinklered. For B, it is 200 feet for non-sprinklered and 300 feet for sprinklered. As we see for travel distance, there are multiple code requirements that can be reduced when an automatic sprinkler system is installed. The codes recognize that an automatic sprinkler system limits the growth of a fire and gives more people time to escape. However, the sprinkler system is only specified to control the fire, not necessarily extinguish it. The egress system must work efficiently in order to make sure that all people get out safely. Our building is sprinklered, so we can adhere to the longer travel distances. The common path of egress travel is the portion of exit access in which the occupants are required to move before two separate and distinct paths of egress travel toward two separate exits are available. In other words, it is the distance before they have two options out. Common paths of egress travel shall be included within the overall travel distance. For buildings with only one exit, all of the exit access is a common path of travel. In the Happy Land Social Club in New York, there was only one designated exit. In 1990, a fire was set by an angry boyfriend of an employee near the only available exit, preventing people from being able to evacuate. 87 people died, many very quickly of smoke inhalation. People need options in case an exit is unusable. The Beverly Hills Supper Club fire of 1977 in Southgate, Kentucky demonstrates the importance of having clearly organized egress. Estimates report that as many as double the amount of allowed people were in attendance at the time of the fire. In addition to being over capacity, having no sprinkler system or fire alarm, and having flammable decor, the egress in the club wasn't adequate. Here we see where the fire started and the exits people used. The fire spread quickly, rendering one exit useless, while the remaining exits in the cabaret room were unmarked, not numerous enough, and not wide enough. There were also long corridors leading to other banquet rooms and unmarked exits. 165 people died, and over 200 were injured. A dead-end corridor is one which does not lead to an exit. The code restricts the length of these to 20 feet. An important exception is that in many occupancies, if a sprinkler system is used, the length of the dead-end corridor can be up to 50 feet. In our example, B and M may take advantage of the exception, but the A2 occupancy, the restaurant, may not. The idea behind this is that it is unsafe for occupants to move down a path that doesn't lead to a protected area, as we saw in the Beverly Hills Supper Club example. We can see in the graphic that not only is this confusing, but it is dangerous in situations with large groups of people. We must imagine how quickly emergencies can happen, and how disorienting it can be trying to find a way out. By the time that a fire alarm is activated, there can be areas within the building where egress may not be possible. Even with sprinklers, one may have smoke from a fire, a loud alarm, and emergency lighting only. People report moving through smoke even when they cannot see the exit. People unfamiliar with the building will typically go back the way that they came in, and if forced to go another way, will try to guess which way the exit is when they cannot see it. To illustrate the importance of these points, we will look at a couple of more devastating nightclub fires that help to define standards in the code. As previously mentioned, nightclubs are particularly vulnerable buildings in terms of code. They hold an assembly of people who are potentially consuming alcohol within a dark, tight space. They have tight security that controls access in and out of the club, and they have performances that can involve hot lights and pyrotechnics adjacent to flammable materials. The Coconut Grove Fire of 1942 in Boston killed almost 500 people. Filled well above capacity on Thanksgiving weekend, the nightclub was decorated with a variety of flammable decorations that blocked views of the exits. When the fire started by something igniting the decorations in a basement lounge, people rushed to the main entry, which was a revolving door. It became jammed, and the fire spread quickly, limiting people's time to find another exit. The other exits were either locked to prevent people leaving without paying, or the door swung inward, so the crush of people rendered it useless. It caused reform to portions of the code to require outward swinging doors, to restrict the bolting of doors and blocking of exit signs, and to require a revolving door to have an outward swinging standard door adjacent to it. Revolving doors should also collapse in the direction of travel for clear passage in an emergency. More recent nightclub fires, despite the code changes and awareness, had similar issues. The Kiss nightclub fire in 2013 in Brazil killed 242 and injured over 600 people. It was overcrowded with inadequate exits. Someone lit an illegal firework inside that ignited acoustic foam in the ceiling. Most of the victims died of smoke inhalation. The Station Fire of 2003 in Rhode Island killed 100 and injured 230.
Once they said Great White was going to be taking the stage, it truly was body to body, shoulder to shoulder. You couldn't turn around, you couldn't twist around. There were a lot of people. Great White came out, Jack Russell said a few words, trying to get the crowd going, and they started into the song Desert Moon, and all of a sudden the pyrotechnics went up. because of where we were standing, Fred had said to me, "Look at that, something's wrong. There's a fire, there's something on fire." And there was a fire exit, maybe 3-4 steps to my right, to our right. And Fred just grabbed my hand and we went over to the fire exit. We got to that fire exit and there was a bouncer standing in the door, in front of the door. And Fred is screaming, "There's a fire, open the door, there's a fire." And the bouncer just stood there and said, no, the door was for the band only and that it was club policy. We got a few steps without it being this mad rush, but then I think all of a sudden it's when the rest of the crowd realized at this point half the ceiling is on fire, the lights are starting to shatter from the heat. It looked like a stampede, something out of a National Geographic. It was just, let's go to that door. If you came in it, you knew that door. Fred's hand was on my back at one point, and all I remember was him pushing me and screaming, "Go." And when I tried to turn around to find him, all I saw were a sea of people, and their heads were on fire. It was melting black rain, what I call black rain. Glass was shattering everywhere, and people's heads were on fire, and Fred was nowhere. And when he pushed me so hard that I actually made it to the front doorway. But at that point, I was stuck. I was wedged in between other people, and I can remember looking around and thinking, I'm done. My life is over. My breaths were getting shorter and shorter. It was getting hotter and hotter to breathe. The smoke was just black smoke. And the last thing I remember is hitting the hardwood floor in the club. And that's my last memory of being in the club.
Pyrotechnics ignited foam on the wall and spread quickly. These clips produced by the National Institute of Standards and Technology reenact the fire and show the difference a sprinkler system could have made. Although a nightclub is required to have a sprinkler system, the station had been a restaurant and was converted to a nightclub. The sprinkler requirement was overlooked in the transition. It takes little time for the flammable acoustic material to ignite and for smoke to spread. A sprinkler system would have saved many lives. The smoke is much less intense and the fire is reduced, but it is clear that people need adequate exiting. There were an adequate number of exits for the calculated occupancy load, but it was over capacity, the entry door was not wide enough, and the door near the stage was reportedly blocked. Other exit doors were in portions of the club that only the staff or people in the immediate vicinity realized were available. For all assembly buildings, the codes recognize that most people will try to exit using the main entrance. Thus, the main entrance must accommodate at least half of the people in the building. In a nightclub and similar buildings, this is increased to 2/3. Generally, from any point in a building, all users must move toward an increasing level of safety. They cannot be in a protected area and move to an exit through an unprotected or less protected area. Storage rooms, closets, kitchens, or machine rooms are not considered protected areas. A protected area is a space or room that has construction that is fire rated. A fire rating may be 1 hour, 2 hour, or 3 hour, for example. Although these have a time component in the name, the fire rating simply refers to a relative level of performance, like A, B, or C. The ratings were established based on the contents of buildings in the early 1900s, although modern furnishings pose much greater risk. They are more flammable and toxic, as we see in this test. Modern synthetic materials burn hotter and faster and can contain hydrocarbons, many forms of which are used as fuel sources that can emit carbon monoxide and cyanide. The level of performance of a wall, ceiling, floor, or door assembly is determined by standard fire testing. Materials and assemblies are tested by the Underwriters Laboratory, Factory Mutual, or a similar testing laboratory. There are many factors that play into the intensity or danger of a fire, including the flammability and toxicity of the furnishings and the construction materials, openness of the space, or origin of the fire. It is important to protect the integrity of the egress system, and to separate uses like parking garages that may pose a threat to more protected uses like residential. Separation is achieved with the UL-rated assemblies. What about sizing the components of the egress system? It is important that the width of the egress elements, exit doors, corridors, and stairs accommodate the number of occupants. These are simple calculations based on the number of occupants, or occupant load, that we determined earlier. Before we do that calculation, we will consider a couple of concepts. First, one must consider the occupant load of each floor to determine the width of the stairs. We assume that the flow down the stairs is steady. The stairs cannot get smaller as they go down, but they do not necessarily have to increase for each floor if the occupant loads per floor are the same or smaller. This is based on the movement of people down a stair. The assumption is that by the time the first person from the floor above gets to the next floor down, that most of the people on the floor have already started down the stairs. There is no limit to the height of enclosed vertical egress stairwells as they are needed for high-rises. In cases where the occupancy loads are higher on upper levels, the stair width all the way down must be sized for that larger occupancy. If there were a large occupancy load from an assembly space, for example, on the third floor of a building, the width of the stairs would need to accommodate that number of people until they exit at the bottom, even if the occupant load of the second floor were small. Second, and conversely unplanned, one must increase the width of egress elements like corridors as occupant load flows merge. It's like two rivers merging to become a wider waterway. Looking at our example's occupant loads, we can determine the width of the stairs for the office floors. To calculate the egress width of stairways, not the overall stairwells, but the stairway area people walk within, we simply multiply the number of occupants of each floor by 0.3 inches per occupant, or by 0.2 inches in a building with automatic sprinklers and an emergency voice and alarm communication system per the IBC. We get 25.4 inches. 44 inches is the minimum width for stairs by code for occupancies greater than 50, so we will use 44 inches. If 2 stairs are required, distribution of egress capacity must be provided. If one exit is lost, the other stairway shall not reduce capacity to less than half of the required capacity. This means if the egress width were calculated at 100 inches, each stair would need to be 50 inches wide because when one exit is blocked, the others must still account for 50% of the occupancy. If there were 3 or more exits provided, then the widths can be different for each exit and add up to 100 inches. The calculation is similar for the corridor width, except the multiplier is 0.2 inches per occupant or 0.15 inches with the sprinkler exception. We use the occupant load of 300, which includes the mezzanine load, from the retail floor. This is greater than the 44-inch minimum, so we will use 45-inch minimum width. For the door width, again the multiplier is 0.2 inches, or 0.15 inches for sprinklered. We will look at the office floor with 127 occupants for these door widths. 19 inches is well below the required 32 inches clear minimum, which is usually achieved in a 36-inch wide door in the open position. Adequate egress width is essential for all building components in order to ensure that people can safely egress the building. Undersized doors in the station nightclub fire led to a blockage of people in the door as they tried to escape. Adequate width is important for entering buildings and enclosed spaces too. In Cincinnati in 1979, an insufficient number of open doors at a concert led to the deaths of 11 people as people pushed towards the entrance to get into the concert. Similarly, at a 2010 festival in Germany, 21 people died from crushed ribs and more than 500 were injured when a ramp between tunnels where people entered became overcrowded. We have noted that even though adequate width might be provided by alternate exits, many people exit the way they entered. Sometimes they might even pass by another exit that may be partially or fully blocked, like this one, to get to the familiar one. Therefore, an architect should consider providing more space at the main entry doors to a building than may be required by code. In addition to adequate width and number of exits, for spaces and buildings needing more than one exit, there must be a remoteness or separation of exits per the codes. If one exit is compromised by fire, smoke, or something else, occupants must have one safe alternative at a distance from that exit. The exit doors must be a distance apart equal to not less than 1/2 of the length of the maximum overall diagonal dimension of the building or area to be served, measured in a straight line between exit doors or exit access doorways. If the building is sprinklered, as in our case, the distance can be 1/3 the diagonal. Do the same thing for the overall office area. We measure the distance between the center of exits most conservatively as a bird would fly over a plan drawing, different from measuring travel distance. Let's review more case studies. Within the code, there are many variations and exceptions based on a building's structure and material, and as previously mentioned, its occupancy classification. Special consideration must be taken when the occupants are not familiar with their surroundings, are hindered in the ability to escape, or are sleeping at the time of an emergency. The MGM Grand Hotel fire of 1980 in Las Vegas highlights the fact that smoke inhalation is a more serious threat to life than flames. Even though the fire department was located across the street and responded very quickly, the fire grew too fast. The main problem in this fire was that there were openings in the vertical elevator shafts, and the structural seismic joints that provided a vertical path for the smoke that started in the lower levels to reach the upper hotel levels where the majority of the 87 fatalities occurred.
Since that fire, what has the hotel industry done and the building industry basically done to rectify situations like that?
Number one, full sprinklers. I mean, that is just the basic tenet for a good fire protection program. It's been proven for over 100 years, well over 100 years, and it was just proven again. But it would really hit home with the hotel-motel industry at that time. Purchasing of furnishings and products that are used in the hotel. Furniture, interior finishes, usually coming from a central supply house or central purchasing. And hotel-motel managers started paying a lot of attention to that because they had to provide fire-safe materials. Obviously, the huge changes it made in Nevada in general to the entire hotel industry and the upgrades that had to be done, especially the retrofit of their existing hotels with sprinklers.
What about the seismic joints and the elevator lobbies, and things like that?
The elevator lobby issue has been pretty well addressed. That's resulted in vestibuled elevator lobbies so that they are enclosed so you don't get smoke spread right up them. Changes in ventilation of hoistways. So that's been addressed. Seismic joints has been a tough problem, and there are now design methods for providing fire resistance so that the seismic joints can still flex but still provide vertical fire separation.
Anything that still needs to be done, or is that?
I think just re-emphasizing the basics, and I think the important part of revisiting the MGM is that you can't forget that basic stuff, and that still has to be addressed. And so that's probably the most important piece of it.
And I called over to my associate's room and told them that I saw smoke. We talked about it being a kitchen fire.
I'd left Marilyn up in the room, and I came down the elevator and walked the length of the casino out the front door, and while I was waiting for my car, I turned around and there was smoke come out the door behind me, followed by a lot of people. The marquee area was already in flames. It happened very fast.
When I heard a lot of running in the hallway, and it just didn't sound normal to me, so I opened the door, and the hallway was just covered with smoke. And I wasn't dressed. I grabbed my coat. I just left. I ran and ran and ran, and I went nowhere.
And Marilyn was still up in the room, and I just ran around like crazy for a couple of hours. People were going crazy, milling around outside, crying, looking for their families. I was one of them.
I opened the hotel door to see what the noise was in the hall. And when I opened the door, thick black smoke just billowed in like ink. And I gasped and just sucked the smoke into my lungs. And it was just like being stabbed in the chest. And I just dropped to the floor.
More Clark County Fire Department fire and rescue units responded. Automatic aid calls brought firefighters from Las Vegas, Henderson, North Las Vegas, and Boulder City, as well as other communities. A total of 544 firefighters responded to the fire.
It was time to get out, so I went out the door, started crawling on my hands and knees. The smoke was just very, very thick. It was impossible to see.
Everybody was waving towels, trying to catch the rescuers' attention. Nobody seemed to know what to do. They didn't know whether they should stay in their rooms. There was no way to get word to them. They were trying to use bullhorns.
The Santiago prison fire of 2010 in Chile brought to light one of the dangers of severely overcrowding prisons. Many inmates could not get out. 81 perished as they were locked in their cells. Because of fires like this, the institutional occupancies have significant limitations on furnishings and other potential fuel sources. The Warrenter nursing home fire in 1957 in Missouri created change in state sprinkler requirements and highlighted the dangers of locking residents in their rooms. Another vulnerable group we must pay special attention to is children, especially the very young ones. Let's consider an elementary school building. The overall occupancy is E for educational, and there are assembly spaces within. Children, although they are typically awake in an elementary school, except maybe nap time in kindergarten, they are not freely evacuating, meaning they are let out by their teachers. They are somewhat familiar with the school building, but mostly within their immediate area. Also, very young children may not understand and could make unsafe decisions like try to hide. In addition, teachers tack flammable items on the wall, and the presence of lockers can hinder egress. For all of these reasons, the codes are more restrictive in educational buildings. One case we study for educational occupancy is the 1958 Our Lady of Angels fire in Chicago, in which 92 school children and 3 nuns died. The school building was grandfathered, meaning that they did not have to comply with all codes due to limitations of the existing building they were occupying. This fire didn't necessarily result in a large number of new fire codes for schools, but it is estimated by the National Fire Protection Association that as many as 68% of U.S. schools completed fire safety improvements soon after this fire. One change was that kindergartners and first graders must be on the ground floor. Another was an increased number of mandated drills. If we take a contemporary elementary school that is equipped with a sprinkler system, we can go through the same process as our mixed-use example. First, we identify its occupancy. The overall building has an educational occupancy, but we have some assembly spaces: the auditorium, A1, cafeteria, A2, gymnasium, A3, and library, A3. We also have business area in the offices, mechanical rooms, and storage. A question to be answered here is whether these spaces are used only by the school children and faculty during the day, or if other groups can come in and use the spaces while students are occupying the building. If it is expected that outside groups will use the space while the classes are in session, then the total occupant load has to account for everyone. If it is only the children and faculty using the spaces, then each individual space must be designed to accommodate the maximum number of people that might be present. Code officials can help interpret this calculation. We will assume in our example that outside groups cannot use the assembly spaces during school hours, so we will calculate the occupant loads of classrooms separately from the assembly spaces. Based on the areas of these spaces, we can calculate the occupant load using the same process we used in the previous example. We don't include an occupant load for the corridors or bathrooms due to the fact that educational is net. When we calculate the educational space's occupant load, we won't include the load for the auditorium, cafeteria, library, gymnasium, or courtyard because we assumed these spaces would not be occupied while the students were in school. We will then compare it to the occupant load of the assembly spaces that can be used by the public. Note that this would be the worst case maximum load, indicating simultaneous use of all the assembly spaces. We will use the greater number to determine the exiting. Our first floor occupant load is higher for the assembly spaces with public access, so be sure to have adequate exiting based on those occupant loads and types. Our second floor occupant load is higher for the educational spaces, so we will use that number for exiting from the second floor. Based on the number of occupants on the first floor, we determine the minimum number of exits, which is 4. And then we will check each area needing more than one exit. In a case like this, some will consider this only as 3 exits, because 2 are close to each other. We could separate these. The auditorium is a special case we will review in a moment. Let's do a quick check of the remoteness or separation of exits. We'll start on the second floor. Check the overall plan remoteness of exits. We shouldn't have a problem since our exits are at the opposite ends of the building and at intervals between. Check the remoteness of exits in specific areas and rooms requiring more than one exit. We'll do the same for the ground floor. It is important to understand in what direction students and faculty will be moving from each space, through the exit access, then through an exit to an exit discharge. Again, there should be options in occupancies requiring 2 or more exits when people are in the exit access, in case one option is blocked or compromised. This will help us to visualize aspects of the egress like common path of travel and travel distance, and to determine which direction exit doors should swing. In this example, we will verify the length of the common path of egress travel. With our occupancies, we are permitted 75 feet. We take the remote point and measure to the point at which 2 path options are available. Note that this distance is included within the overall travel distance. As before, we look at allowable travel distance. For education and assembly, it is 250 feet maximum for a sprinklered building. We have an exit from the most remote point within 250 feet. We do a check that dead-end corridors are less than 50 feet. In this building, we have open stairs, but we have 3 enclosed fire stairs for fire exit access. It is allowed to use open stairs in a few cases, but it is recommended to provide enclosed stairs. Escalators are not considered an emergency means of egress, and elevators are only allowed as accessible means of egress if there are more than 4 stories above or below the exit discharge. Now we can verify the required width of stairs by multiplying the second floor occupant load times 0.2 inches per occupant. We take the 174 inches and divide it by 3 stairs to get 58 inches for each stair. This is more than the 44-inch minimum, so we will use 58 inches. The corridor width is the occupant load times 0.15 inches, which equals 130 inches. For educational group occupancies greater than 100, the minimum is 72 inches. Ours is wider, so we will go with the wider 130 inches, or 10 feet 10 inches. The width of doors is determined for each area by multiplying the occupant load times 0.15 inches. We have 3 doors, so each one should be 43.3 inches wide. We get more than that by having 2 doors at each exit. This should be done for each space. In this classroom, we get 10.8 inches, and 32 inches door clearance is the minimum, so we will go with 32 inches. Let's take a look at one of the assembly spaces in a bit more detail, the auditorium. The concepts are the same, but the requirements are more specific. The occupant load is 563, the number of fixed seats plus the net area of the stage divided by 15. This means we need 3 exits. We check the remoteness in plan. We meet separation. There are many options in seat and aisle layouts that are covered in the code. In our example, we have 3 aisles that serve the seating in the back and 2 aisles in the front. Aisles serve as the exit access in this space, similar to how corridors serve rooms or spaces. Our aisles and floor are ramped at a slope less than 1 to 12, or an 8% slope, and there are no balconies. In this relatively small auditorium, we will assume we do not have an expensive smoke protection system with automatic ventilation. That is often used in larger assembly buildings. Let's consider travel distance. It is still 250 feet because it is sprinklered. It is measured within the aisles and aisle access, not over any seating. Since the occupant load is above 300, the IBC and NFPA 101 notes that the entrance door width should be sized to take at least 1/2 of the occupants, because this is the most familiar exit. This is good practice in any case, since the crowd is usually exiting all at the same time after a performance. The other 2 exits should handle 1/3 of the occupants each. When added together, it actually totals more than the calculated occupant load, but some duplication ensures that a large crowd has some options. For door width, take the occupant load times 0.15 inches per occupant. In any vestibule, be sure to have 48 inches between doors in the open position. To calculate the aisle width, consider where the people will be exiting. Use that area's occupant load and multiply that times 0.2 inches per occupant, the factor for aisle width. For a ramped aisle with seating on both sides, the minimum is 42 inches, unless the aisle serves less than 50 seats. The aisle minimum is 36 inches. Remember to read all of the exceptions. Generally, the process is to consider both the overall building egress and each particular space's egress. We have covered the basics of emergency egress that are best incorporated early during design. Changes made late in the process can be very time-consuming and costly. Clear and efficient circulation system design that incorporates an understanding of people's experience will incidentally provide good egress. It is important to realize the origins of and concepts behind the code standards, but each project needs to be researched, particularly for local amendments. Code officials can help with this and should be partners in the design process. The better we all understand the spirit of the building and of the code and communicate clearly, the better we can navigate some of the gray areas of the code that need to be interpreted. In every project, there are a variety of solutions. We are all designing to protect the health, safety, and welfare of society, not just building owners. This involves an intimate knowledge of the standards related to each building's use. The standards are a result of case studies, testing, and the study of human behavior in a building. The circulation system within a building should consider the interaction of people, wayfinding, and formal relationships of spaces. It can contribute to the efficiency of a building and the well-being of its users. It is like the human circulatory system that keeps our bodies functioning well on an everyday basis. An emergency egress system, like a human circulatory system during heavy exercise or under stress, must function with added flow and pressure, working efficiently with other building systems. Good design results in good emergency egress.